福康宁山，新加坡喧嚣繁华市中心里头最清新宜人的绿肺。虽然海拔只有50米，它却具有制高点的优势，在新加坡700年历史发展中占据显赫地位，曾经是主权的象征。山上现在还留下残余建筑，勾勒出不同时代主权的盛衰兴亡。年代最悠久、保存最完整的，要数伊斯干达沙圣墓了。平日这里一片冷清寂静，只有在不寻常的日子里，才会出现热闹的景象。今年斋戒月第19天，不少回教徒特地相约而来。
This place is a more traditional place. Many people feel this Karamat come right. Many people happy. The prosperity. So many people come. People think, 19 must come the Fort Canning Park. This is a mindset. This year my father come, my grandfather come. I also follow. This place is a very holy place.
伊斯干达沙是新加坡拉王朝的末代国王，他的圣墓是马来皇权的象征。根据马来纪年记载，在14世纪，新加坡拉王朝先后有5位君王住在这座山上。1299年，苏门答腊的势理佛氏巨港王子沙尼拉乌塔玛外出打猎时，发现海岛丹马西，建立了新加坡拉王朝。沙尼拉乌塔玛在山上兴建皇宫，山下筑起围墙，禁止老百姓上山，因此当时这里称为禁山。学者认为，禁山的位置有利于新加坡拉王朝的立国。
福康宁山是在新加坡河口那一带，它是比较高的一座山，能够居高临下。这个地方建立一个王宫的话，它进可攻，退可守，这个在战略方面，它是一个非常重要的考虑。
新加坡拉，也就是丹马西。中国元朝商人汪大渊曾2次航海经过这里。他在著作《岛夷志略》提到，丹马西由龙牙门和班族组成。考古学家推断，班族指的是福康宁山。
And he said that the main place where the people of Singapore lived was on a hill, and he called the hill Bansu, which comes from the Malay word spring of water, Pansuur. This is where the Malay princesses used to bathe. It was somewhere around this slope of Fort Canning Hill. They said it was 500 feet from the riverbank, which is about this far from the junction of River Valley Road and Hill Street.
Mixic 在1984年接受国家博物馆前馆长柯宗元邀请，来新加坡展开考古挖掘，对新加坡的历史追本溯源。
Try not to brush too much on that. Just this.
You can see it. You're doing something normal.
过去34年，考古团队总共在山上挖出3万多件文物碎片。
Okay, now I have to do the base. Base is tough.
他们找到14世纪的文化层，确认出土文物中有中国元朝的陶器、白瓷、青瓷等。
I can't see. Why don't you take that?
富康宁山上就是有3个文化层呢，最底层的就是最久的，或是元代的，就是一个 brown color 的，而且它的泥土就是有点像 clay 一样的了。富康宁山的那些瓷器的品质比较好，因为当时在富康宁14世纪的时候，大多数都是贵族或是王族所居住的地方。那些瓷器或是陶器，大多数都是从中国出口的，因为在附近的地方是没有出产这些东西的。
Mexic 也从1万多颗出土的玻璃珠子及碎片中推断，进山上有匠人工厂为皇族制作首饰。
One of the most surprising discoveries on Fort Canning was these 10,000 glass beads. They're not very common in China themselves, and we only found them on Fort Canning, nowhere else. We find them all in the fort area, so they must have been used by the royalty of Singapore in the 14th century.
这些考古发现证实，14世纪的淡马锡是马六甲海峡南部的货物中转站，和中国有一定的贸易交往。不过，这个小岛国后来却为何沉寂下来，在历史长河里静默了几百年？时光倒流到700年前。在进山兴国立业的新加坡拉王朝，其实一直受到周边强国的虎视眈眈。1347年至1362年间，第2任国王在位时，外敌2次入侵。第一次，暹罗素可泰王朝派了70艘战船进攻。
汪大院的记载是，整整1个月的时间，进攻不下，因为新加坡拉它有200-300艘船，它就能够抵挡这个进攻。
第2次新加坡拉迎战爪哇满者伯夷帝国，对方也铩羽而归。
有些非常激烈，非常惨烈。据马来纪年的记载是血流成河的一个现状，所以这两个外患是非常可以看得出当时的环境是非常恶劣的。
新加坡拉虽是个小国，实力却不容小觑。然而，第5任国王拜里米苏拉继位后，却被大臣出卖，导致新加坡拉在1398年遭满者伯夷灭国。据说，拜里米苏拉逃到马六甲，建立新王朝，娶了穆斯林女子为妻，改信伊斯兰教，也改名伊斯干达沙。传说他死后被运回新加坡安葬，长眠于这个圣墓底下。不过 ，Mexic 在圣墓周边挖掘，并没有发现任何墓穴。
And since he was driven away, he probably didn't come back here to be buried either. He's probably buried in Malacca, although we never found his grave. And there was no tombstone at Fort Canning at all, no gravestones. So we excavated around the modern site, and we dug down about 2 meters. We found nothing at all.
历时约100年的新加坡拉王朝灭亡后，淡马锡失去自主权，先后成为马六甲王国、柔佛王国的属地。进山随后沉寂长达400年，直到英国人的到来。这幅画是东印度公司职员莱佛士1819年登陆新加坡时所看到的景象。1个星期后，莱佛士便和天猛公阿多拉曼及柔佛苏丹东姑胡申签约，在新加坡发展商港。
罗是很特别，它是把这个地方不建立城堡，它是建立一个叫做自由港口。这自由港口的话，它要确保航线不要被阻碍。它不像那个其他的西班牙、葡萄牙，他们的占领过后呢，这是大屠杀。
与来佛士随行的法夸尔被委任为驻扎官，成为第一个踏上进山的英国官员。
Fort Canning became known as the Forbidden Hill during the time of Raffles, when the local Malays told the British here, Farquhar, don't climb the hill. It's full of ghosts of the old sultans. It's forbidden for us to go up. Farquhar did not believe that. He said, what rubbish, and he went up the hill.
进山有了新的名字，叫政府山。英国由此开始了对新加坡长达146年的统治。头2任驻扎官法夸尔和戈罗福在来佛士别墅办公，规划新加坡的开埠发展。戈罗福后来更说服天猛公阿都拉曼和柔佛苏丹东姑胡申，在1824年8月2日签订新条约，将新加坡管辖权全部交给英国东印度公司。
It was at that bungalow enlarged that John Crawford persuaded Sultan Hussein and his Temenggung, yeah, you want, more payments, more this, more that. We are prepared to just sign over Singapore to us. So that treaty of ceding Singapore to the East India Company was actually signed on Fort Canning.
签约2年后，新加坡成为海峡殖民地，来佛士别墅改为总督府。来佛士的登陆改变了新加坡的命运，他自己的运气却不好。他来过新加坡3次，1822年最后一次踏足时，健康已亮起红灯。
He had these terrible headaches where he complained in his letters, "Oh, I'm going to die in Singapore. This terrible headache. I was in bed for 1 week, couldn't move."
来佛士在山上别墅疗养8个月，和他亲手培植的香料园相伴，度过人生的低谷。
And he once said if he died in Singapore, that he would have the honor of his bones mixing with the ashes of the Malay kings. He was very romantic on that point. He was very sick a lot of the time he lived here. And so he felt better when he lived up on the hill because the air was fresher and there was a wind blowing.
在东南亚闯荡19年的来佛士，1824年回返英国，不堪官司缠绕，2年后病逝，无缘再见新加坡的蜕变。俯瞰新加坡市区的福康宁山，过去200年看尽繁华来去。开埠后不久，四方商贾云集，新加坡河上一片繁荣景象。从那个时候开始，政府山经历不同的阶段和改变，数度易名。历史上有人称它为皇家山、升旗山。山上的建筑拆拆建建，凸显了英国管制下的新加坡不只是为宗主国创造经济利益的殖民地，也是具有防御功能的军事基地。 新加坡迎来海上贸易的辉煌年代之后，山上竖起旗杆，给停靠的船只引航，因此有了升旗山的别称。苏伊士运河开通后，新加坡成为欧洲和东亚之间的重要港口，货运量大增。后来，山上增添灯塔和报时球。
Whenever there was a new ship coming in the harbor, they would run some flags up on the flagstaff on Fort Canning. And every day they also set the time by firing a cannon. Exactly 12 noon, they would shoot off a cannon on the hill, and that would tell everybody it's 12 o'clock noon. And most people didn't have clocks or watches yet. So it was used for a number of official kinds of purposes, signaling to the general population.
19世纪是大英帝国的全盛时期，它从1840年代起把新加坡视为远东的军事据点，政府山因此肩负起防卫重任。殖民政府在1860年拆除总督府，兴建军事防御设施，并且以英属印度首任总督康宁爵士的名字称这里为康宁堡垒。堡垒设置7尊大炮，一方面防御敌人的海上攻击，另一方面保护新加坡的欧洲社群。
In the 1850s, there were these already riots between the different Chinese clans and monks, very severe riots, destabilizing the community. Where do the few Europeans go to? So Fort Canning was built as a place for the Europeans to run to when there were riots.
不过，康宁堡垒似乎没有发挥军事功能。1907年，堡垒拆除，只留下城门。1926年，山上挖建地下蓄水池，为市区增长的人口提供水源。国际局势在1930年代趋向紧张，使英国提高防备。在山上增建军营，还有9公尺深的地下作战指挥总部。二战时，英军在这里指挥马来亚驻军抵御日军。
They built a big underground bunker, which had all the communications equipment, radio, telephone, and they could keep in contact with the ships out at sea. They could keep in contact with the anti-aircraft defenses, with the Air Force that they had. So it was a nerve center, not just for Singapore, but for all between Singapore and Hong Kong. A very large area included the Malay Peninsula, included Borneo at that time, Sarawak and Sabah. So it was where the British had, it was the most fortified site in Singapore.
不过，当日军南下入侵时，英国却节节败退。1942年2月15日，英军驻新加坡最高指挥官白思华在这里做出历史性的决定，向日本投降。地下指挥中心变成日军司令部，直到日本战败撤退。战后，黄家山逐渐褪去政治色彩，成为民众休闲的中央公园。山脚下兴建国家剧场，承载许多国人的集体回忆。 尽管命运多变，福康宁山的存在，对某些人仍然具有神圣的意义。
来这里祈祷一下，然后呢，就刚好这个时间是我们开斋的时间，就我们每个人都会带食物来啊，然后就是大家都是很高兴的围在一起的 break 这个 fast。我们希望这个传统能够这样代代的传下去。
700年，岁月悠悠，青山依旧在，但不再是高不可攀，而是让人休闲散心、俯仰古今的一座净山。